On the moral plane they are so much lightened that the man who has reached it appears to us almost superhuman in his patience under crushing trials and his forbearance in the face of malignant persecution. To live in perfect goodness is to realize one's life in the infinitive. This is the most comprehensive view of life which we can have by our inherent power of the moral vision of the wholeness of life. And the teaching of Buddha is to cultivate this moral power to the highest extent, to know that our field of activities is not bound to the plane of our narrow self. This is the vision of the heavenly kingdom of Christ. When we attain to that universal life, which is the moral life, we become freed from the bonds of pleasure and pain, and the place vacated by ourself becomes filled with an unspeakable joy which springs from measureless love. In this state the soul's activity is all the more heightened. Only its motive power is not from desires, but in its own joy. This is the Karma Yoga of the Gita, the way to become one with the infinite activity by the exercise of the activity of disinterested goodness. When Buddha mentioned upon the way of realizing mankind from the grip of misery, he came to this truth, that when man attains his highest end by merging the individual in the universal, he becomes free from the thraldom of pain. Let us consider this point more fully. A student of mine once related to me his adventure in a storm, and complained that all the time he was troubled with the feeling that this great commotion in nature behaved to him as if he were no more than a mere handful of dust. That he was a distinct personality with a will of his own had not the least influence upon what was happening. I said, if consideration for our individuality could sway nature from her path, then it would be the individuals who would suffer most. But he persisted in his doubt, saying that there was this fact which could not be ignored, the feeling that I am. The I in us seeks for a relation which is individual to it. I replied that the relation of the I is with something which is not I. So we must have a medium which is common to both, and we must be absolutely certain that it is the same to the I as it is to the not I. This is what needs repeating here. We have to keep in mind that our individuality, by its nature, is impelled to seek for the universal. Our body can only die if it tries to eat its own substance, and our I loses the meaning of its function if it can only see itself. Just as we find that the stronger the imagination, the less is it merely imaginary, and the more is it in harmony with truth, so we see the more vigorous our individuality, the more does it widen towards the universal. For the greatness of a personality is not in itself, but in its content, which is universal, just as the depth of a lake is judged not by the size of its cavity, but by the depth of its water. So if it is a truth that the yearning of our nature is for reality, and that our personality cannot be happy with the fantastic universe of its own creation, then it is clearly best for it that our will can only deal with things by following their law, and cannot do with them just as it pleases. This unyielding sureness of reality sometimes crosses our will, and very often leads us to disaster, just as the firmness of the earth invariably hurts the falling child who is learning to walk. Nevertheless, it is the same firmness that hurts him which makes his walking possible. Once, while passing under a bridge, the mast of my boat got stuck in one of its girders. If only for a moment the mast would have bent an inch or two, or the bridge raised its back like a yawning cat, or the river given in, it would have been all right with me. But they took no notice of my helplessness. That is the very reason why I could make use of the river, and sail upon it with the help of the mast, and that is why, when its current was inconvenient, I could rely upon the bridge. Things are what they are, and we have to know them if we would deal with them, and knowledge of them is possible because our wish is not their law. This knowledge is a joy to us, For the knowledge is one of the channels of our relation with the things outside us. It is making them our own, and thus widening the limit of our self. At every step we have to take into account others than ourselves, for only in death are we alone. A poet is a true poet when he can make his personal idea joyful to all men, which he could not do if he had not a medium common to all his audience. This common language has its own law which the poet must discover and follow, by doing which he becomes true and attains poetical immortality. We see then that man's individuality is not his highest truth. There is that in him which is universal. If he were made to live in a world where his own self was the only factor to consider, then that would be the worst prison imaginable to him. For man's deepest joy is in growing greater and greater by more and more union with the All. This, as we have seen, would be an impossibility if there were no law common to all. Only by discovering the law and following it do we become great, do we realize the universal. While, so long as our individual desires are at conflict with the universal law, we suffer pain and are futile. There was a time when we prayed for special concessions. We expected that the laws of nature should be held in abeyance for our own convenience. But now we know better. We know that law cannot be set aside, and in this knowledge we have become strong. For this law is not something apart from us, it is our own. The universal power which is manifested in the universal law is one with our own power. It will thwart us where we are small, where we are against the current of things, but it will help us where we are great, where we are in unison with the All. Thus, through the help of science, as we come to know more of the laws of nature, we gain in power. We tend to attain a universal body. Our organ of sight, our organ of locomotion, our physical strength becomes worldwide. Steam and electricity become our nerve and muscle. Thus we find that, just as throughout our bodily organization there is a principle of relation by virtue of which we can call the entire body our own, and can use it as such, so all through the universe there is that principle of uninterrupted relation by virtue of which we can call the whole world our extended body and use it accordingly. And in this age of science it is our endeavor fully to establish our claim to our world self. We know all our poverty and sufferings are owing to our inability to realize this legitimate claim of ours. Really, there is no limit to our powers, for we are not outside the universal power, which is the expression of universal law. We are on our way to overcome disease and death, to conquer pain and poverty. For through scientific knowledge we are ever on our way to realize the universal in its physical aspect. And as we make progress we find that pain, disease, and poverty of power are not absolute, but that it is only the want of adjustment of our individual self to our universal self which gives rise to them. It is the same with our spiritual life. When the individual man in us chafes against the lawful rule of the universal man, we become morally small, and we must suffer. In such a condition, our successes are our greatest failures, and the very fulfillment of our desires leaves us poorer. We hanker after special gains for ourselves. We want to enjoy privileges which none else can share with us, but everything that is absolutely special must keep up a perpetual warfare with what is general. In such a state of civil war, man always lives behind barricades, and in any civilization which is selfish, our homes are not real homes, but artificial barriers around us.